One of the mistakes that many on the left make is to assume that big corporate media is inherently conservative because it's a business and they also do business with other big businesses. Another mistake that so many on the left do is to assume that big corporations are also inherently conservative because it's conservatives that tend to defend property rights and the freedom of association with the purpose of profit. Yet none of these assumptions are true. The overwhelming majority of big businesses and big media and billionaires back the left or the far left. Is this a case of conservatives getting the short end of the stick by not being reciprocated? Perhaps. But the issue is a little bit more complex than that. Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to another installment of Freedom Alternative Research and Analysis. Okay, this one is a bit more complicated because it involves a lot of background information and it helps if one has read a few books such as Free to Choose by Dr. Milton Friedman or Economic Facts and Fallacies by Dr. Thomas Sowell. Now, I will try my best to balance the amount of background information and appeals to previous writings with present-day issues in order to both keep this video interesting and explain in great detail why is it the case that big business backs the left on economic policies, though it is the case on social policies too, though not always, in spite of the fact that it would seem to be in their best interests to back the right, at least on economic policies. Anyway, so let's get started. First of all, let's use as a template the article published at the beginning of September by Wall Street Journal titled "Donors in Most Industries Back Hillary Clinton." Now, I'm not going to read you the article because it's too long and has a lot of subtle spins in it that it's not worth the time spent on debunking them. Link is in the low bar for those who want to fact check me, and I encourage you to read it anyway, just so you can familiarize yourselves on how to do agitprop amongst the rich, because there's a different technique there. So, the article says, and I have no reason to doubt the veracity of the numbers, that employees from industry overwhelmingly back Hillary. The scare codes that I'm adding are because the employees from industry, they mean lawyers and law firms, tech giants, real estate speculators, doctors, Wall Street employees, and music and film industry. I mean, yeah, sure, these are industries, but it's quite different from what you and I think when we hear the term industry. That's why I am not reading the article. The spin applied into the story is quite subtle and astounding. Anyway, the article also tells us that among the top 10 companies whose employees overwhelmingly donated to the Hillary campaign are Facebook, Google, and major corporate lawyer firms such as Jones Day LLP. Meanwhile, the top 10 companies for Trump are, and I quote, a 5-acre hog from in a farm in Riverdale, California, a garlic producer in Gilroy, California, and an Anchorage, Alaska-based clothing and home furnishing retailer called Snow Leopard. It almost seems like the little guy and the small and medium businesses are backing Trump, and the so-called evil big capitalist corporations are backing the left, isn't it? The left routinely complains, especially whenever they think conservatives aren't watching, such as private far-left forums and chat rooms, that the poor are just bloody stupid. Now, why do they think that? Because according to actual leftists who work in boots-on-the-ground campaigns, the poor are continuously and constantly voting against their interests when they vote for the right, as they, the leftists that is, really feel that they have the lower income people's interests at heart and could clearly represent them better. This is what leftists actually think. And they also think that the fact that the poor don't really vote for them in more and more countries is a bug, a problem that needs to be dealt with. And when pressed harder, that's usually the reason the left supports massive immigration. They want to get themselves a new proletariat. I explained more about this in this video. Now, whether you agree with the leftist rationale or not, and I obviously do not, that is what they believe. The question is whether conservatives have a legitimate case to complain that the big businesses are bloody stupid because they're voting against their interests by backing the left when the right would clearly represent them better. Which one is correct? Well, the answer is none of them are correct. The left, as it is today, does not represent the lower income people's best interests, and the right is fractured, to say the least. But in any event, the consistent economic right wing does not and cannot represent the interests of big businesses better, not even by a long shot. And I'm referring here to the principles and not the politicians, because oftentimes the full principles of the left are not fully represented by the politicians of the left or by the winning leftist politicians, and the same is oftentimes true with the right. There is a reason why terms such as Reno still do exist. Now, explaining why the left doesn't have the lower classes' best interest at heart and why the right doesn't have the big businesses' interest at heart is a bit tricky, so please do bear with me. Now, I mentioned the word interests several times, and that's not by accident, nor is it an attempt to borrow from the language of the left. Milton Friedman used to routinely say, especially in official hearings about trade policies, that things get a lot easier if we look at issues in terms of interests rather than in ideological terms or in terms of simple policy. In other words, looking at who benefits can help one make much more sense of other people's decisions on how to back, including on who to back, including and especially the decisions made by businesses. Now, to understand that, the easiest way is to get back to the basics. So, what is the basic economic interest of the right? Well, free markets. Now, are free markets in the best interest of businesses, particularly big businesses? And the answer is no, absolutely not. No business, and particularly big businesses, likes free markets. Why would they? Free markets means competition. It means increased chances of going bankrupt or incur severe losses due to inefficiency or superior innovation that comes from a competitor. Free markets means a lot of work to keep yourself above. Free markets are not good for businesses, especially the established big businesses. Who has the biggest vested interest in free markets, whether they realize it or not? It's the consumers, particularly very poor consumers who benefit the most from free markets due to increased opportunities and, very important, cheap stuff. Computers or TV sets that are so cheap that even the poor have at least two of them in their households did not come about by accident, but through the long and painful process of cutthroat competition between manufacturers. I mean, think about it. Nobody can even conceive these days to spend his or her 2 months or 3 months earnings on the lowest available TV set. I mean, top-end TV sets are still within the range of 1 month's earnings, even for poorer countries. Do you think the manufacturers are happy with that? Of course not. But they have no choice. The market has spoken, and they can choose to abide by it or go out of business. Okay. Now that we have established who has the biggest interests in the free market and why businesses do not have an interest at all in this, let's examine a bit what is the best interest of any big business. Well, both by pure logic and by following the actions of big businesses in the political arena, it is pretty straightforward to determine that. Any business, and particularly big businesses, wants as little competition as possible, as many privileges as possible, as long as those privileges are not extended to others, especially its niche competitors, and generally anything that can give itself an edge over its competitors. Now, there are two ways to obtain that. One of them is to please your customers so much that they would voluntarily shower you with shekels and place you into a position of natural monopoly, or dominant position, as the competition law terminology would call it. And some companies did achieve that, even if for a brief period of time. One such example is Microsoft, which did not become a huge monopoly because of an evil conspiracy, but because most consumers preferred its product, for better or worse, mostly for worse, if you are to ask me, but then again, that is irrelevant. The second way to obtain this is to buy your own politicians to enact legislation that directly or indirectly benefits you. And this is where the can of worms resides. Now, most laws and regulations of this kind aren't so easy to spot, especially now since it is no longer politically feasible to explicitly mention private actors within the texts of the laws. But nevertheless, following the money, one can find those laws. For instance, minimum wage laws are an example of laws that fundamentally favor big businesses at the expense of small and medium enterprises, for the simple reason that a big business can incur the extra cost easier, especially when that extra cost comes with the benefit of several competitors going bankrupt. Now, for the leftist-minded who watch this video, that extra cost doesn't necessarily mean bigger wages for the bottom of the company. It can mean the cost of automation, as it is already happening with fast food chains. So in the case of minimum wage laws, they not only kill the jobs of those whose positions get automated faster than they should, but they also kill the current and future jobs of those who work and or would have worked for smaller fast food stores or mom and pop stores or gas stations or whatever. This benefits big businesses in multiple ways that it pays off the extra initial cost of the measure, because not only it lowers the cost of business over the long run, but also lowers the chance of being outcompeted, since the minimum wage is now another entry barrier that prevents future companies from being formed in the first place that would have otherwise been formed, all else being equal, except for the minimum wage. Now, another example that comes to mind is regulations of any kind. For instance, let's say health regulations on construction sites. I mean, have you looked at how the Empire State Building was built? I mean, there are videos from the construction site available on YouTube and other websites. You should look that up. Anyone even remotely familiar with regulations will immediately realize upon watching those videos that under the current system there would be no other Empire State Building, since the building itself is illegal now. In 1930, there were next to no regulations for construction workers. They were indeed very well paid compared to the market rate of the time, but nobody mandated them to wear $5,000 suits, cords for extra safety, $300 helmets, and to have $600 glasses mandatory whenever cutting steel, or mandatory extinguishers at every floor. And these are just the beginning. And that's before I go into zoning laws, permits, urbanism planning commission approvals, and a gazillion of other regulations that make the erection of another Empire State Building to be next to impossible in modern times, or at best to be at least 5 to 7 times more expensive in real terms, adjusted for inflation, than it was in 1930. Now, all those regulations, most of them, mind you, unnecessary, represent an entry barrier on the market in and of themselves. And who benefits from those? Well, it's certainly not the consumers. The biggest beneficiaries of such regulations are the already established companies who have already built their most expensive projects and would prefer not to have some random schmuck with a family business come in and start competing with them by building faster, better, and more reliably, and especially cheaper. Now, in fact, this is why big companies love regulations so much. I mean, leftists usually say, oh, come on, look, this company approves of our regulation. Why are you being so mean? But while regulations do affect them negatively over the short run, they do pay off over the long run with so many potential competitors that never emerge in the first place. Who loses the most from these kinds of regulations? The consumer does, because less competition almost always means higher prices for crappier products. A real life example would be the housing in rent controlled cities. I did explain this in this video. Why rent control basically makes things worse for consumers and for small landlords, but it is a godsend for big developers. Now, I didn't mention then when I made that video, but I will say now that rent control fundamentally privileges the established big developers. Developers, not landlords. If you had your project just finished and then tomorrow comes in rent control, in just a few short years your housing will be the best on the market, and if your project is big enough, you win because of scale, where small landlords cannot win no matter how much they try. Another real-life example is the rule to have your vegetables certified by a central state authority and have specific types of labeling, which is something that is a thing in the European Union, even if you don't sell your products across state lines. Now, if you're a big producer that produces, let's say, 20 million tons of tomatoes per season, that extra cost of sending someone to get that damn certificate is manageable, and the labeling process can be automated, and the investment in automation pays off in 1 or 2 years. However, if you're a small, non-incorporated producer that still wants to do what he's been doing for decades, namely to sell some of your tomatoes from your garden to the farmer's market, this issue is a disaster. There are many small producers across Europe with minuscule productions compared to the big players. Some of them have been supporting a family on those profits, or maybe I should say used to support a family, because as of 2013 or 2015, that is no longer possible. Small farms that used to have profits between 700 and 900 euros a month are now required to pay 1,000 euros annually just for these papers, in addition to the usual income taxes and social contributions, and in addition to the cost of labeling according to the standards, which they cannot afford to automate because the initial investment is usually in the tens of thousands of euros area. Many of those farms have gone bankrupt. Also, the law is putting additional requirements and thus additional costs on small producers who don't have an incorporated LLC or something similar, because their income wouldn't be worth the hassle of incorporating anyway. Had they been making the same income from selling shoes, the law would have left them alone, because for now there is no organized lobby of shoe sellers. But there is such thing as big agriculture, and the European Commission is more than happy to claim that it consults with the producers and then only speak with the top 5 companies and claim that they know what the industry wants or needs. Now, mind you, this example is not a specific indictment of the European Commission. All governments have this problem in some industries. But anyway, the point is that regulations benefit big corporations and harm the little guy, whether that little guy is a small business owner or a consumer. Now that we have established both that the interests of big businesses are not aligned with the interests of the right and the market, and we have also established that the interests of big businesses do indeed lie in a bigger government, now we can finally attempt to answer why big business tends to back the left. And after we do that, we will deliver some caveats and poke some small holes into my argument, and then we're done. I told you it's as complicated. So, to answer the big question, we will do the same as we did before. Go back to the basics. What is the main ideological interest of the left? Well, it is to get the state involved in as many things as possible, not necessarily to take over, but to regulate and meddle and interfere as much as possible, with the view that the state can do better than individuals and small groups. Now, whether that's true or not is irrelevant. The main ideological interest on the economic left is to regulate as much as possible. Now, this interest of the left intersects very well with the interests of big businesses, but these two also intersect with the main interest of any politician, namely to be re-elected. That's why any politician that's what any politician ultimately wants, to be re-elected. Politicians, are just like everyone else. They want a cushy job with as many perks as possible and with as little hassle as possible. And at the intersection of these three interests, namely the ideological leftist interest to regulate, the big business interest to be regulated, and the human interest of the politician to be re-elected, we find regulations. Now, why is that? Because in order for the politician to be re-elected, he has to pander to his or her base. And the base has a vested ideological interest to regulate. So the politician correctly identifies an opportunity. He can make both the big business and his base happy, and in the process get himself re-elected on the message that he did the right thing. It's a lethal combination, really. And this recipe works and has been working for 100 years now, and sometimes even more in some cases. All right, and here come the caveats. What I just said about politicians applies to all politicians, not just the politicians of the left. Politicians of the right also have an inherent interest in being re-elected above all else. As such, it is hardly surprising when you see politicians of the right joining the politicians of the left to pass retarded legislation that fundamentally harms consumers or poor people or lowers the general degree of economic freedom. However, this is what makes the job of politicians of the right a lot harder. The politician of the right has a problem that his colleagues on the left do not. The politician of the right has, at least in theory, a base that does not resonate with regulations. In theory, the ideological interest of the base of the politician of the right is to have fewer regulation. Now, that is, of course, in theory. In practice, we've seen, well, what I like to call right-wing socialists advocating utterly moronic policies that harm the consumers, and politicians of the right willing to pick that up and run with it whilst ignoring the rest of the base. This is basically what happened with the Republican Party in the States, and why the establishment GOP was so frightened of the Tea Party movement, which was basically a movement to reassert what the GOP base is supposed to be. The establishmentarians of the party had every reason to be scared. The Tea Party movement came with the risk of ruining their cushy jobs, or of making their jobs harder because they now had to appeal to them too. And it's hard to convincingly appeal to your base whilst helping initiatives that fundamentally run contrary to the interests of your base. And it's because of this situation why big businesses overwhelmingly tend to back politicians of the left. It's really pure pragmatism and interests. The politicians of the left have one fewer obstacle to bypass. The base of the politicians of the left already favors regulations, so it is easier for the politician to sell a new initiative of this kind to his or her base. The politician of the right has a less congruent base on this issue, and thus has fewer chances of selling such an initiative to his or her base. So, from a purely business perspective, an investment into a politician of the left is much safer, and that is what big businesses are doing: investing in politicians. Phew, that was complicated. So yeah, basically the big business back the left so they can then team up with the successful politicians of the left in screwing their smaller, less connected competitors, and in doing so, screwing the consumer in the process, which may eventually end up on welfare, thus dependent on the government and the potential new voter. It's a win-win for everyone except your average citizen, and especially your average productive citizen. In short, We lose, they win. Is there any recourse? Well, yes. Assert your interest in the free market louder, convince others that free markets are in fact in their interest as well, and then together vote out the politicians who swallowed the poisoned pill of regulation and collectivism and replace them with those who are slightly better than that. Now, do you think that's hard to do? Well, welcome to the real world where things are nowhere near that simple. We have very good cookies on the right, but we also have a tragic vision. Perfection doesn't exist, solutions don't exist, only trade-offs, and freedom needs to be defended daily, for we may be on the side of light, but we're not on the side of entropy. Entropy and inertia belong to the left. Over the long run, the permanent solution is to remove the power itself from the state to meddle in. If that power doesn't exist, there's nothing for big businesses to buy. Basically, separate the economy from the state, just like we separated religion from the state several centuries ago. And just like with religion, if we ever manage to do this, then another several centuries of vigorously defending the accomplishment will have to follow. Yes, freedom is hard work, both to obtain it and to maintain it. I wish I had better news, but hey, at least now you know why big businesses back the left almost always, and even when they don't, it's often still a politician of the right that acts in conjunction with the left. So now it's your turn to tell me where I'm wrong, and if you think I'm wrong, please do tell me why do you think big businesses overwhelmingly back the left. Maybe I'm missing something, who knows? In any event, as the autumn progresses, I'll be making more of these kinds of videos since now the nights are long enough and allow me to think and research for stuff. I have the best inspiration when it's dark and quiet, so summers aren't my best moments for sure. Anyway, with all of that being said, thank you for watching and I'll see you around on Freedom Alternative.